Right now, there is an uproar in Kiev and throughout the European NATO sphere. Behind closed doors, there has been a frenzy of activity and growing panic. Major revisions have been announced by the United States, Ukraine, and the European side to Donald Trump's much promoted 28-point peace plan. Western mainstream media has been calling this plan a gift to Russia, a Kremlin wish list. I want to cut through that narrative and see what is actually happening and what this reveals about the balance of power, the battlefield, and the emerging multipolar order. First, about these rewrites. The truth is that nobody outside a very small circle knows precisely what has been rewritten. There has been no clear public announcement detailing which points have been changed. We have heard that Trump's people, with figures like Keith Kellogg involved, put together a draft. We have heard that Ukrainian officials with names like Yermak constantly appearing in circulation, and various European leaders have been pushing back and proposing changes. Zelensky himself has said that things are changing in the negotiations and that updates are being made to the document. Some American officials seem satisfied. Some Ukrainian reports say things are moving forward. Others are more pessimistic, especially about the size of Ukraine's future army and the question of withdrawing from the Donbass. We know this for certain. The key controversial issues from the Ukrainian side include one, the size and structure of the Ukrainian army, and two, any requirement for Kiev to withdraw from the Donbass or accept a demilitarized zone that implicitly recognizes Russian gains. Those are friction points. On the diplomatic track, Zelensky is heading to Washington, and select European leaders, people like Meloni and Macron, are also expected to arrive in Washington to discuss these core issues and more. The idea seems to be to finalize Ukraine's and Europe's edits and then take something to Moscow. From the Russian side, we have had signals from figures like Ushakov, a close aide to Putin, that Moscow has received the plan, is reviewing it, and is prepared to negotiate on its basis. The tone coming from the Kremlin is that they are ready to talk. There are points they agree with and others they do not, and modifications will be needed, but they are working with this 28-point document. That alone is very revealing. Russia is not saying this is outrageous, we refuse to discuss it. Instead, they are calmly indicating that they are prepared to use it as a possible initial framework. Now, let's be clear. In my opinion, this is not a real peace plan in the traditional sense. It looks more like a brainstorming document on a cocktail napkin that Trump's circle put together under time pressure because the front line is collapsing. It is reminiscent of Angela Merkel rushing to Moscow during the Debaltseve Cauldron in 2015, when Kiev's troops were trapped and the Germans rushed to get Minsk II signed to avoid total disaster. I see a similar dynamic here. Trump does not want a catastrophic collapse under his watch, so he has pushed a plan that is more about optics and timing than a carefully designed diplomatic agreement. That brings us directly to Trump's negotiating style. Trump is a master at controlling the media cycle. He loves to seize the news agenda before holidays, before big political moments. So he throws out a 28-point plan, leaks it to friendly media, lets others find out about it, and suddenly everyone is reacting to his initiative. He positions himself as the narrative pole. Here is my deal. Take it or leave it. Decide by this deadline. That is classic Trump. The problem is that this style is fundamentally incompatible with serious international diplomacy for a conflict of this scale and gravity. A genuine agreement would require months, even years, of quiet negotiations, multiple rounds of intensive talks, liaison teams going back and forth, and a summit only after a detailed text with contingencies and fallback positions had been agreed behind closed doors. You would need technical annexes, verification mechanisms, phased timelines, clear security guarantees, and agreed procedures for handling violations. That is how serious diplomacy works. Instead, Trump believes he can rewrite the book on diplomacy by scribbling some points on a metaphorical napkin, throwing it through his media ecosystem, and forcing everyone to react in public under artificial deadlines. Yes, that is brilliant for media control. He is very good at that, but it is a recipe for escalation, not stable peace. Once you throw something like this into the public domain and apply a deadline to Ukraine, say around November 27, you trigger resistance, panic, and posturing. That act by this date or else. Logic can easily backfire, especially if your stated goal is to end the war through negotiation. If Washington's real intention were to end the war, this approach is flawed. If the hidden intention is to prolong things, maintain the status quo, and preserve excuses for continued escalation and funding, then the plan and its inevitable failure provide exactly that. More crises, more summits, more bases, more contracts. If Ukraine resists or if Europe objects, Trump can say he offered a perfectly good deal, the greatest peace plan in history. They rejected it. He tried. And the war continues with Russia advancing and the West making money and positioning itself. It is important to recognize at least one positive, at least on paper, some of Russia's core strategic concerns that were raised long before the conflict. For example, in Russia's December 2021 proposals to the United States have been acknowledged in this plan, at least superficially. It talks about limits on Ukrainian armed forces. It talks about neutrality. It talks about restructuring NATO's relationship with Ukraine. That is not nothing. It suggests that parts of the American establishment now understand that some of Russia's red lines are real and must be addressed. There is also an underlying long-standing impulse, both in Washington and Moscow, to avoid direct great power war. That impulse still exists, but the methods Trump is using generally do not work. We have seen a pattern of failure, not just in Ukraine, but also in Iran, Gaza, and other theaters. The root causes: NATO expansion, the security architecture in Europe, denazification and demilitarization in Ukraine, the energy and economic architecture, the status of Crimea and Donbass, cannot be solved by a rushed marketing exercise. Now, let's dig into the leaked details of the plan itself and why, in many ways, it is a bad deal for Russia, despite Western claims that it is a gift to Putin. According to the leaks, the plan proposes allowing Ukraine to have an army of up to 600,000 troops, granting Ukraine fast-track entry to the European Union, keeping Ukraine formally outside NATO but granting it NATO-style security guarantees, Article 5 commitments, creating a demilitarized zone in the Donbass and recognizing some territories as de facto Russian, but simultaneously locking 25% of Donetsk in a demilitarized zone where Russia itself cannot legally deploy, using approximately $300 billion in seized Russian assets to rebuild Ukraine, with the United States taking 50% of reconstruction contract profits, encouraging Europe to contribute another $100 billion of its own money, while the United States puts in no equivalent direct money for reconstruction, opening the door for cooperation between the United States and Russia on Arctic and energy projects, with the United States positioning itself to benefit from both sides, leaving key issues like the Orthodox Church, the status of the Russian language in Ukraine, and broader cultural guarantees to be governed by European Union values and human rights standards that have already been used to erode those things over the past decade. If you look at this carefully, it becomes clear that the plan was not written by the Kremlin. It was written by people in Washington who want to secure a Ukraine that is neutral in name only, with a large army, deep integration into European Union structures, including the future European Union Army, and Western security guarantees that amount to NATO in everything but name. It does not fully recognize Russia's territorial claims in Donetsk, one of Moscow's explicit goals. It keeps frozen Russian assets out of Russian hands and treats them as a slush fund for Western contractors and banks. It offers American gains in reconstruction and a privileged position in Arctic deals. While Russia is supposed to accept Western governance over orthodoxy and the Russian population within Ukraine, calling that Putin's wish list is propaganda. Is it also painful for Ukraine? In some ways, yes. Some points would be very difficult for Zelensky to sell to the hardline nationalist and Bandera influenced constituencies within Ukraine. But overall, in its leaked form, the plan looks more like an attempt to freeze Russian gains, prevent a complete Russian victory, and transform Ukraine into a heavily armed buffer state, anchored in the European Union, controlled by the West. So, why is Russia considering this? Because Russia has the leverage and knows it. Moscow can afford to play along, signal flexibility, and let the West and Kyiv twist in the wind while the battlefield continues to move in Russia's favor. That is what is driving all of this, not think tank theories, but reality on the ground. On the front lines, there is a clear pattern of Ukrainian collapse in multiple sectors. Russian forces have been advancing in Zaporizhia, pushing toward places like Guliapol and moving toward key nodes. They are grinding through the fortifications in the Donbass. Once the Russian army takes Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, and the agglomeration, it is essentially a straight line to the Dnieper. The Dnieper River is Ukraine's economic artery. If Russia secures the east and reaches the Dnieper, the economic viability of the remaining Ukrainian state collapses. That is why the Dnieper figures so prominently in Western discussions and in this plan. Some people in Washington understand that at all costs they must prevent Russia from reaching that river in force. The panic you see, the rush for a freeze, is driven by this battlefield calculation. Western media obsesses over territory. Kilometers gained, villages captured, maps with red arrows minimize attrition, but the attrition numbers, especially Ukrainian casualties, are catastrophic. There are reports of body exchanges indicating ratios as bad as 40 Ukrainian soldiers for every one Russian in some cases. That kind of disproportionate attrition combined with steady Russian territorial gains is politically devastating for the narrative that Russia is a paper tiger and Russia is losing waves of men. Yet that propaganda is still what many European parliaments are being fed by their own officials and experts. And if Trump genuinely wanted to end this war, he could blow up that propaganda pillar tomorrow by declassifying the real casualty numbers and forcing a new debate in Europe. Instead, his administration is trying to have it both ways: protect his image as the supreme deal maker, avoid an Afghanistan style collapse, and keep the money flowing to defense contractors. Trump's fear of presiding over a collapse even worse than Kabul is palpable. Ukraine crumbling on television, entire fronts collapsing, mass surrenders. The Dnieper breached would make Afghanistan look like a footnote. I suspect the fear is one of his primary motivations right now. Once he realized that the reports that Russia is collapsing that he was receiving were false, after he was told, for example, that some thin line of 60 Russian soldiers was supposedly all that was holding critical points like Kurakhove and Pokrovsk, and then saw Russia systematically capture those places, he got scared. That was when he told his people to put something together, talk to whoever they needed to talk to. He would sell it, package it, push it through his media and Truth Social, make it look like the best peace plan ever. From Trump's point of view, all scenarios give him some room to maneuver. If Ukraine accepts the plan, he can claim a historic diplomatic victory. If Russia accepts or negotiates modifications, he claims he ended the war on his terms. If one or the other or both reject, he blames them. He had a big, beautiful plan, 28 points, the best ever, and they refused. He tried, and the war continues with Russia advancing and the West making money and positioning itself. That is the key phrase. It is not my war. He has been saying that from the beginning. He insists that the conflict never would have happened if he had been president from 2020 onward, which is simply false. The structural drivers were in place long before. But as long as he keeps repeating that it is Biden's war, Obama's war, NATO's war, he avoids owning it the way a serious statesman must. A true American president functioning as a serious global actor does not speak in terms of my war versus Biden's war. He speaks as the president of the United States with continuity across administrations. He accepts that his office inherits the consequences of predecessors' actions and that he must own, manage, and resolve the situation. Trump's refusal to do that undermines his credibility as a mediator, even if Russia is willing to humor him and let him play the role. Why is Russia willing to play along at all? Because they have priced Trump into the equation. They know they have to deal with this administration in Washington, and that at least with Trump, they have someone in the White House who can be talked to directly and who is not fully captured by the same crowd that surrounded Obama and Biden. They also know that in a few years there will be another president, possibly a Democrat, possibly a different Republican like J.D. Vance, and that everything could be undone. So they are hedging, they are looking for diplomatic normalization, consulates reopened, diplomatic and banking restrictions lifted, 25-mile travel limits for Russian diplomats in the United States as a precondition for serious negotiations. If the United States restored normal diplomatic relations and lifted some of the more absurd restrictions, that would send a powerful signal of good faith to Moscow. But so far, that foundational work is not happening. Instead, the focus is on the big splash of a peace plan. Europe and Kiev also have their own reasons to resist any final settlement right now. For European leaders, the war in Ukraine has become existential for their political legitimacy. The entire European project, Brussels authority, NATO's self image, the story they tell their own citizens about democracy, rules based order, and borders that cannot be changed by force, depends on the Ukraine narrative. If this ends with an acknowledged Russian victory, or even a perception that Russia got the better of the West, then Europeans will ask, what was the point of all this? Why they deindustrialized our economies, blew up our energy relationships with Russia, ruined German industry, pushed us into a debt spiral only to lose. The ratings of leaders like Scholz, Macron, and Starmer are already disastrous. They do not want the war to end in a way that forces them to confront the domestic crises they have ignored. They do not want to explain why they insisted the Russian economy was collapsing when it was not, why they said Moscow was running out of missiles when it clearly is not, why they told their publics the Russian military was falling apart while it advances and adapts. It is much easier to keep the war going and push everything into the fog of long-term support and shared sacrifice. For Zelensky, the logic is even more brutal. His job in practical terms is to keep the money flowing. As long as Western funds and weapons continue to arrive, he can keep the oligarchs fed, the nationalist battalions loyal, and his inner circle afloat. If he fails at that, he is finished politically and probably physically. That is why he always pushes for more weapons, longer range missiles, more money, more sanctions, more security guarantees. Ending the war, especially in a way that looks like defeat, would expose the corruption, the scandals, and the ugly reality on the ground in Kiev. All of this is happening within a much larger global realignment. The phone call between Trump and Xi Jinping is part of that context. Trump immediately jumped on his platform and said everything was excellent. They talked about farmers, Ukraine, Russia, China. It is strong. Xi is a leader. Maybe he will visit China in April. The usual salesman routine. But if you read the formal readout from the Chinese side, you see something different. Carefully structured sections on Taiwan, implementation of prior summit commitments, the Ukraine crisis, and the broader global order. Beijing is watching how the United States tries to pivot away from Ukraine toward confrontation and containment in Asia. Within the United States, domestic politics is shaping foreign policy. The appetite for the Ukraine project is waning. The spectacle in the Middle East after October 7 has split public attention and exposed contradictions in the American position. MAGA voters are divided on Ukraine and Israel, but on China they are remarkably unified. Large majorities see China as a major threat and fear a Chinese-led global order if American influence recedes. That China threat mentality pushes Trump toward more confrontational rhetoric and policy in the Pacific.